Well, good morning. My name is Skruch, and my profession is that I'm a sales engineer, and that's the person that works with account executives to help sell software and hardware to companies. And I provide the technical proof of whatever the solution is. It's a great job for me because it's really half sales and half technical. So for somebody who's half introvert and half extrovert, it works out really well. Who's trying to get both those things in there. I currently work for a company that does low-code software, but I just took that job recently. But for the 6 years before, I worked for two companies in the telematics world, Verizon Connect, and then most recently Samsara. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of the things I learned from that experience about the telematics market. So companies that need to track their trucks and vehicles and equipment out in the field, and how do they do that particular segment of IT. And we're going to talk about some of the solutions that are available and how those work together. All right. Before I do that, though, I want to do a little introductory story about some things that I learned. I do enjoy traveling, and with my job, I fortunately had the opportunity to travel a lot. Even during COVID, we got to go out because in the telematics world, the customers are all essential businesses that had to operate through COVID, and their equipment still had to be used in the field. So I would get to go to customers, and while we couldn't go inside in the office, we would meet in the parking lot and just stand there and talk amongst their trucks and things like that. But over the years, I picked up some tips on travel. I wanted to share a few of them with you. The first one is, if you're in a hotel and you want to create a stand-up desk, you can do this by taking the drawers out of the dresser and putting them on top of the table. I have a little bit of carpal tunnel, so it's uncomfortable for me to type sitting, especially like in a hotel that sometimes the chairs are low and the desk is real high. So I'll make myself a stand-up desk. And I also have on the far right or far back there, I also have a little thin monitor that I use as well too, a little USB monitor that I can take with me so you can have a second monitor on the building. The next tip is how to get a good seat on a plane. When you fly a lot, you do get frequent flyer miles, and sometimes you're able to upgrade, but you can upgrade your chances by finding a flight that happens to be like a wide-body aircraft on a domestic route. And what like American Airlines will do is they will often run a 777 or 787 Dallas, LA, Dallas, Chicago, Dallas, Miami. So if you look for those flights, when you get on them, the business class seats for an upgrade are a lot more opportunity. There's a lot more chance you can get. So that's an opportunity where I got to sit in like a live flat seat just for a domestic flight, things like that. Okay. And then the last tip is what to do if you go to a city where rental cars are short of supply. And this happened a lot here during COVID. And this particular picture here, the woman in the picture is Chelsea Murray. She was an account executive of mine when I worked for Samsara. And she's very innovative in solving problems. We had a trip to Montgomery, Alabama. Our plane was late the night before, and so we missed the rental car reservation. And the next day, there was just like no rental cars of any kind. So Chelsea got the idea that she had heard that people were renting U-Hauls. So she was able to find a nearby U-Haul dealer, and we got a van that we rented to drive to the hour away where the customer was. And Chelsea, I really appreciate it too, is most account executives, like in the telematics world, they really don't want to get their hands dirty. When you go out and work with the trucks, they kind of sit back. But Chelsea was always ready to dig in, and if she wasn't busy with the customer and had something else, she would ask for a screwdriver and she'd climb under the dashboard and help out. So, okay. So anyway, that was just a little bit kind of understand a little bit about me. Now we're going to get started in the actual material itself. So I'm going to kind of go 5 sections here. First, a little definition of what the telematics industry is and some definitions and just how things are defined. And then we're going to look at the specific areas of telematics. First, vehicle telematics, tracking vehicles, and then also the driver has requirements for electronic logging devices which track driver hours, and that's part of that market. We're going to look at dash cams and safety because that's an important segment, and a camera really is an IoT sensor, right? And then we'll look at trailer and asset telematics. So tracking the other objects besides just the vehicles themselves that drive, and finish up with some other applications, some related things to telematics. All right, so we'll get started now with our definition of telematics in the industry. So first thing I want to talk about is how are telematics different from IoT in general? And the first thing is that vehicle telematics are actually one of the oldest IoT applications that there are, because there's been GPS trackers for over 30 years. So it's happened a long time that's been replaced, and a lot of the companies have had their fourth and fifth generation of device. It's very unusual to talk to a company in the trucking or business that doesn't have some sort of tracking already. So a lot of the talk track when you're helping serve those customers is improving on what they currently do. The other thing that's unique about vehicles is that they're a real high value asset. So the cost of a cell plan for just an IoT device or a tracking device is reasonable, and you can justify it. So that actually makes communications easy. You don't have to worry about trying to find some less expensive way of communicating that we often find in IoT devices. The driver ELD requirements I mentioned, that's important. We've got, there's regulations that require the drivers get certain rest periods, so that has to be tracked. Any vehicle that has a driver subject to that has to have a telematics device in to record when the vehicle's moving. And the companies have to be able to account for all the drive time of their vehicles, either assigned to a driver with their hours or have some other sort of explanation about why. The vehicle asset market is huge. We'll go through some numbers in a minute. A lot of companies out there that need the equipment, but also a lot of vendors that are selling it. And so that makes it kind of challenging sometimes to differentiate, because some of the capabilities really are kind of almost generic kind of things. The telematics systems are mission critical systems, however. These days, knowing where your vehicles are, knowing what your drivers are doing is very important. And knowing even more detail, like with the dash cams, about are your drivers behaving responsibly, those are all important pieces of information. And because the hardware is needed in the vehicles, it's important that hardware be dependable. And it's out on trucks that are getting banged up and in harsh hot and cold conditions, et cetera. So it's very important that the hardware itself be reliable and then have support systems behind it. The hardware needs to be repaired, that can be quickly repaired and so forth and things like that. And then finally, the driver and the people in the office, their experience with the back-end data is also very important. It's not just collecting the data, not just having a map of knowing where your vehicles are, but there's other information along the way. Okay, so we talk about types of vehicles here. We're going to first talk about the heavy-duty trucks, and there's classes 1 through 8 of vehicles, and class 8 is the larger semi-trucks that you'll see a lot on the road. On the left side, you see an example of that. And the units that have a trailer attached to them, these are called tractors or power units. You may have heard the term tractor, trailer, that sort of thing. So those are the units that pull different kinds of trailers and loads around. And that's kind of the most common in transportation. These particular devices or particular vehicles have on the back kind of a flat area on the back with a round circular thing that they call the fifth wheel. And that's basically where the trailer locks into to be pulled across the road. And then there's 2 types of cabs in these. The day cab is for a truck that's used in local area. And then over the road truckers will use the sleeper cabin, which has actually a living area attached to the back. So that when the drivers have to stop for their rest periods overnight, they have a place to stay. On the right side are trucks that are not tractor trailers. The truck itself is a complete unit, and we'll call those straight trucks. So like a box truck that just has a box that the freight can go in. You also have dump trucks and other types of specialty trucks as well. And when you talk about these larger vehicles, there's these 6 manufacturer brands that you see there. Those are the main manufacturers that sell those particular vehicles. Okay. The trailers that the tractors pull are shown here, and there's some different examples there. The dry van's just a simple cargo container that you put different items in. The standard size of that normally is about a 53-foot trailer. And then there's specialty types of cargo trucks like that they call refrigerated trucks or reefers. And those will be just like a dry van, but they'll have a refrigerated unit on the front that either keeps the load of food inside, either cold or frozen, depending on the particular needs there. And then left side are some specialties. A bulk trailer, which would carry, could carry chemicals, or open trailers that will carry, construction materials and things like that. And then on the lower right, there's an example of a flatbed truck that's shown here. And that particular picture was a fun opportunity I got as part of my job. I like to be out and play with trucks and stuff. That's fun. But that is at the Volvo truck plant in Virginia, where I attended an event there. And two of my most fun experiences as a sales engineer were at the Volvo truck plant in Virginia and then Allison Transmission's main facility in Indiana. And when you go out to visit a company, you go in and they may engage in some hospitality. You get there and say, hey, would you like a cup of coffee or something like that? But I found that truck manufacturers, their kind of pleasantry or hospitality is they say, well, after the meeting, do you want to go out on the test track and drive a truck?
Yeah.
And so that is the truck that I actually drove around the test track. That's a simulated load on the back, so I got to do that. But the most fun event I actually had was at the Allison transmission plant in Indiana. They had a dirt hill that was about 100 foot tall. And to show how the transmission works, they had us drive a dump truck halfway up the hill and then take your feet off the pedals. And the transmission just caught it, so it didn't roll backwards. And that was really fun. So it was really okay, and then we took the other types of vehicles, medium and light duty trucks. That's the terminology for those. That comes from service vans that are service fleets, special big kind of trucks, like especially pickups that have toolboxes that in a truck that does the landscaping service that has special equipment on it. I included passenger transit in here as well. And then airport vehicles are kind of their own specialty. So there's all kinds of different vehicles in that category that needs to be tracked. That Southwest truck in the lower left there, that was taken at Love Field. We did call on them for a particular opportunity we had. One thing that was kind of funny when I was there, they gave us a list of all their assets, and they had this description that said Provo truck. And so I looked on the internet to see the manufacturer named Provo or something like that, and I couldn't find anything. And finally, I found this obscure Southwest little article, and Provo actually stands for provisioning. And that's just a word that Southwest made up, but it became such a part of their lingo that the term Provo is something they use. So that was kind of interesting. And it's also interesting that a lot of industries and like this have very special language they use. And if you are selling into that market, you need to understand, some of their terminology. All right, and then lastly, we have other types of assets. These are going to be, equipment that's not necessarily drivable on the roadways, but like construction equipment, generators, equipment in a rail yard when you move containers around, and then airport ground support equipment. Those are all examples of types of assets that you can track. Most of those have some sort of power source in them that you can tap into with your telematics device in order to provide some power for that. And knowing location and that these equipment is operating or not is important too. All right, so that's the basics of terminology and things like that. Do you have any questions on that section? All right, next let's jump into vehicle telematics and ELD. So how big is the commercial vehicle market? And this question was actually, I had a lot of trouble answering this. I couldn't find a good authoritative source. And a lot of it because of that, the terminology of how things are used was kind of hard to read through. But these are some numbers I got that give the general perspective of how the market looks. So there's about a little less than 40 million trucks in the US that are registered for some sort of business purpose. And about 4 million of those are the heavy Class 8 trucks. So that means there's a lot of other, although those kind of things that you naturally think of, there's a lot less of those than all those other applications. Almost 12 million medium duty and over 23 million just pickup and vans, smaller vehicles that are used for commercial purposes and things like that. But certainly the biggest market is going to be your larger, over-the-road firms that spend a lot of time with, calling expensive cars. The top 500 freight carriers operate about 546,000 trucks. And then there's over 1 million for hire freight carriers. So there's just a ton of companies. So a lot of smaller players in that. About 95% of the freight carriers have 10 or less trucks. So that means there's just a lot of small operators out there. And then 99% of the firms have 100 or fewer trucks. So that's interesting. The market's really split. There's some very large enterprise companies on one end, and then there's just a ton of smaller companies that trail off on the side. And their needs are similar. It's just kind of the sales motion tends to be different though. The enterprise has a different, a much more complicated decision process. But on the other hand, the smaller companies often want as much attention as you want with a larger company, and it's just not not cost effective for a vendor to have in-person sales forces to call on somebody that just has 10 trucks. So a lot of that type of thing is done over the phone. So. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how how the information is actually collected. So there's going to be some sort of telematics device in the vehicle. And I have an example, physical one here, one of those Samsara devices. And the way they typically work is the GPS or the telematics device itself has a GPS chip in it and GPS antenna inside. It also has a cellular modem and a cellular antenna as well as a processor. And it will collect data on its own. It will know its location from GPS, and it'll know when it's turned on by if it's getting power or not. But it also will get information from the vehicle as well. So this cable will connect into the vehicle's diagnostic port. This is one that would fit in the passenger car. And this is just a little plug that's normally underneath the dashboard. And when you go into the shop, they plug into this to read trouble codes and things like that. But for a telematics device, it plugs in there, and then this actually plugs into the one that's in the vehicle, and then it leaves a new one out here. So that way maintenance people can still come in and work on top of it. And some of the vehicles that I worked on actually had like 2 other devices already there before we added this device for a trial. For different reasons, they'll have multiple devices. So that's how that works, the general way that works. The larger trucks will have this type of connector, which is called the J1939 little round connector. And this is what's generally used on heavy duty trucks. And then I have a picture on the left side that RP1226, that's a new kind of connector that the newer trucks are installing since 2019. And that was put in the truck specifically for telematics, cameras, other third-party devices. And that's in addition to the normal diagnostic port. And those are put behind the dashboard, and some of them put up in the headliner. And that just makes it easy for companies to install equipment and then still be able to read information out of the vehicle. Right, and then I also mentioned that the left side is showing some of the companies that provide their own trackers, like Samsara that I worked for. Geotab is a company that has their Go device, but there's some examples on the left side of those telematics devices. There also are companies that are white label manufacturers. I listed 2 examples there that some of the other telematics companies use their hardware. And so there's a lot of that going on as far as sharing hardware and things like that. And then the vehicle manufacturers are also starting to put devices in the vehicles as well, which 6 years ago, I would have thought there would be no more aftermarket devices now because the manufacturers were in a position just to do it. But that hasn't turned out to be true. The manufacturer's perspective of what's needed in the marketplace, they kind of don't quite understand it. They also have a really long lead time for how their vehicle cycles are. So most companies will use aftermarket device just because it has better capability.
For the cellular connections, there's got to be some issues occasionally with being able to get a connection.
Yep.
Is there much multi-carrier, capability built into these, or are they usually a single carrier? Do you know, or
most companies are single. Some are doing things. Samsara's newest device actually has a dual SIM chip that can do multiple networks and things like that. It does cost a little more because you end up having to pay data to the alternate plan as well too. Even if you don't use it very much, right? Things like that. So they're definitely offering more of those. The devices will also cache the information. So while you're driving along, like you can look at the vehicle almost real time, showing you its location that goes somewhere without cell coverage. It'll disappear if you're looking at it live. And then once it connects again, it fills in the data. Yes.
How safe are these? I just, in today's Wall Street Journal, I have a story. T-Mobile got hacked for all 37 million of its customers. You're going on the sales stuff. How safe are these? And can somebody do the ultimate thing like you see in the movies, hack into the truck and crash?
Yeah. So the same things risk you have for security in the cellular network in general apply here. But the advantage is if cellular network security is generally better than Wi-Fi and other things like that. So on that, the way the current methodology is with those devices, they don't write back to the diagnostic port. If some of them just, it'll ask for a result to be sent to them. But the connection for these it's a pretty old technology. And there's really not the ability for it to link back in. And certainly the newer autonomous vehicles that have newer technology, they actually have more risk of hacking and things like that. That's certainly considered. Yes.
Question. How much of the diagnostic devices that you showed in the previous slide, how much of those would be useful in an EV truck?
Yeah, all the same things apply with EV, and maybe sometimes more so. It's just different sets of diagnostics. And for example, one of the projects I worked on at Verizon, we were working with Nissan for their Leaf, putting a device in there. So it had different type of things. There's some differences because like a gas vehicle or internal combustion vehicle typically starts up and you leave it on and you do whatever. With electric, you stop at a stoplight and the power's off, right? So the way you track power is important to do that. And then the battery life, which is not an issue, a gas vehicle, you want to know the fuel quantity, electric vehicle, you need to know the battery capacity. So that was one of the things that Nissan, they originally thought about their reporting. They only reported data when the EV powered up and powered down. So if you wanted to know what the battery power was, they actually didn't have that information in their device. And that's why we were working for Verizon, because the fleet customers wanted to know, all right, I'm charging an EV, how well charged is it? So if somebody wants to rent this EV for car shares. All right.
Can I make a point?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, about 50% of the EVs do not have an OBD2 port in them.
Really?
There's no mandate for it.
Yeah.
The OBD2 port mandate came from the Federal Highway Traffic Safety Institute, actually mandating that to determine diagnostics of combustion engines.
Yeah.
So it's not a combustion engine, right? They're in hybrids, but they're not in all. So most of the EV guys aren't looking at let's go with an aftermarket. They're already well ahead of everything. It's a software-defined car, right? It's a software-defined vehicle.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really kind of current state, but certainly the newer vehicles, particularly EVs, they have that in there. Although, again, even with that, they could miss the mark with a few things, but certainly there's going to be much of a need to, rather than do it yourself hardware from the diagnostic port, there's going to be much more working with the manufacturers to link things together, doing data share by API data transfer instead of just having to collect.
Yeah, and you were at Verizon, right? The Hughes Telematics legacy stuff. A lot of that stuff was 2-wired or 3-wired in and not even using the OBD2. So it was just hardwired into the vehicle. So.
How are they getting diagnostics? Is it USB or is it just a connection wireless?
Well, that's the thing. A lot of this stuff, they can't gather some of the diagnostics. There was a mandate put out where manufacturers have to provide, a base layer of information, but not all the codes that go through OBD2 are actually opened up and given to the different manufacturers or the different fleet management software companies, right? So simple things, which are diagnostic to the vehicle that could damage the vehicle, are given like idle time, engine run time, temperature, things like that. But specific codes like door unlock, lock, things like that may or may not be open. Depends on the openness of the OEM, auto OEM to provide that, and the relationship that they actually have with the device manufacturer, with whether it's third-party device, a cat lamp, for example. Amazon hires engineers they go every day, open a door, close the door, plug the device in and try and find a code.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's some things like odometer, which is so important to reporting. There are some manufacturers that it's just really hard to find. That was frustrating. We, provide the customers that they would, hook up their whole fleet, and then 10% of vehicles wouldn't report odometer. There's manual ways you can record.
But I also have an OBD2.
So that's an opportunity. for that. These are some of the
Yeah, I
types
can
of
remote
data that
control.
are collected. So the engine diagnostics on the right, that's what we're talking about there. Things that you get from the diagnostic port that tell how the engine's running, what the current odometer reading is, what the speed is, which can be important for like dash cam applications and things like that. So those are all types of data that you can collect. The GPS breadcrumb trail, knowing the GPS location, that's valuable to know where they are. And then you can mix in things like geofence boundaries to know when is a vehicle in a particular location, at a customer when it's supposed to be, is it back in the yard when it's supposed to be.
And
that sort of thing.
then I've got
And then the bottom,
notes
some
as
other
well.
types of things. Equipment has its own types of data that you need. Sometimes there's diagnostic data from that.
Oh, nice.
Sometimes there's not. The driver information, the driver's keeping track of where they are. Then all this information you collect has to be combined with other things that you know about the company. What's the organization about? Which trucks are in which division? Which managers need to look at that data and so forth. That's all part of the things that you do with the telematics. All right,
Like a
so the other
supercharged
thing
version
that
of
happen
that.
is once you've tracking the basic vehicle information, the vehicle does other things as well. So it could be a school bus that has a stop sign that comes out. If the door opens on and off the school bus. Some school districts are even having, electronic cards that the kids have to scan in and out and then down the bus, things like that. So these are just some of those applications of other types of data. The street sweeping device there, which have all these brushes and things that go on. That was pretty fascinating application there because you always see kind of trash on the freeway, on the roadways and stuff, and you think maybe every couple months somebody cleans things up. But I was amazed to find there's some parts of freeways in Dallas where they literally run the street sweeper every single night along the median. And just the amount of trash that's on the roadways is just huge. But it's very important for a company like that to understand where their vehicles are the drivers really doing what they're supposed to, how much trash have they picked up, and all those kind of things. And so lots of applications there. Lift gates in the back of trucks. When is that operating? Service trucks that have an aerial platform. When is that raised up? A lot of companies now have single drivers that work with an aerial platform, so they need emergency communication in case something happens when they've got the platform up and the equipment fails where they can't get down and they're just by themselves. So the lone worker aspect is part of it. So all these other things from they're happening on the vehicle or that the operator is doing, that all needs to be integrated with the telematics data to give companies a real picture of what's going on.
I'm just curious, are you doing people count at all? Because you've got students on board, off board.
Yeah, in that particular case, there were a couple companies that are first student, that particular busing chain. I worked a little bit there, and that's what they were trying to do, was be able to actually know that. So because parents would want to know not only where the bus was, but was my kid actually on it, and they're having the record that they do.
On a municipality level, like you're talking about the trash collection, do they have an interactive map that shows you like where they've gone and what they need to do next? Because you mentioned
Yeah, that was
some places have to be done every day. I figure with like snow plows and things like that in the northern things that would be really useful. Do they have something like that? And has AI been applied to it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. That's one of the requirements, like a trash pickup, is that they need telematics very often. The reporting interval needs to be short because they literally need to be able to see that they went by a particular house. A lot of them are also putting camera systems that will film or take a still shot at each place where they collect the materials and things like that. So some of that is really sophisticated of tracking those close stops for like trash collection. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
All right. So now we've kind of talked about the vehicle telematics thing. I wanted to talk about some of the vendors here. And I do have to say that there's just many devices out there. There's over 833 approved electronic logging devices out there that are available for customers. So I'm just giving you an example of some of the larger companies that I encountered working in my job at Samsara and Verizon Connect, where we work with enterprise with the very larger companies as well. And Dave's here from Teletrek and another player that didn't happen to encounter them very much, so I didn't put them on. But There's all kinds of companies that provide good solutions and they're out there for, depending on the market. But in the upper left, Geotab is probably the biggest current vendor that there is. Their CEO posted on LinkedIn a month ago that they just passed 3.2 billion vehicles connected. So I think that's probably the largest market share that I know of. Although if you think about the whole market, we talked about 40 million, the number before, that's still less than 10% of the market, for one vendor. So it's still very splintered, the number of companies that are out there. In the lower left, we have two companies, one called Omnitracs, which is now owned by Solara, and another one called PeopleNet, that's owned by Trimble. These were traditionally the big companies that were alive in the trucking market. And it started out very early, 1988, 1994. One of the early leaders, a lot of companies had the truck in. They have a lot of their technology, though, a little outdated from what the customers tell me. And newer companies like Samsara, for example, were only there because the companies that had those particular pieces of equipment were looking for changes for whatever reason, or looking for improvements. So both Omnitracs and PeopleNet, I think, at least flattened out their growth in the market and probably lost some customers, because I would see them a lot when I would go out and talk to companies that were looking to replace their vendors. Interestingly, Geotab I didn't encounter very often, and I'm thinking that's because most people that had Geotab were pretty happy with it. So that's kind of my unscientific way of looking at that. All right, so I mentioned Samsara and Verizon Connect that I work for. Both those companies, provide things. Samsara definitely is a newer company, along with Motive in the lower right, that were established relatively recently. They have come in and kind of taken advantage of where some of the incumbent vendors didn't quite innovate fast enough, and we were able to put things in. And they all have different approaches in the market. Samsara, from the beginning, had proprietary hardware, and they thought that part was very important. So they didn't use anyone else's devices. Verizon, on the other hand, white labeled other companies that produce devices for the most part. So different strategies that they're trying to go there. Verizon Connect is, I think, is an example of a company that, to me, was a little bit disappointing, to be honest. I worked for a company called Technologists that Verizon bought in 2016. They also bought another company called Fleetmatics, and then they had their existing company, Network Fleet, that we mentioned before. They put those all together, but they didn't really try to merge the technologies or merge the business units, and all three of those brands are still separate. And so, and a lot of people I know from intelligence world have gone out to other jobs and stuff like that. So I often tell people that Samsara is the company that Verizon could have been. Verizon, and particularly the intelligence technology, was really up there, was really doing well, but it didn't kind of move it forward. So that was it's kind of interesting how you approach the market can kind of affect what. And then lastly, I'll talk about platform science in the upper right. Their particular niche is over-the-road trucking transportation, and they're very strongly related to the driver experience. So their device and the driver experience is combined together, and they have a complete toolkit for essentially building custom driver apps that do all kinds of things. So this is very appealing to some of the large companies. Walmart's one of their big customers that want to really control the whole experience. The downside is somebody's got to write that, even with low-code tools and things like that. You've got to spend the time to put it together. So particularly medium-sized trucking companies don't generally want to do that. So their niche is really kind of a little bit small there, but it's interesting technology where they're just in that niche. And for other capabilities like cameras and things like that, they have to look at other options. All right. So that gets through the vehicle telematics, and that's kind of the main application that I wanted to talk about today. But now I want to talk about a little bit some of the other things around. First, we'll talk about dash cams and safety. And again, the camera is a type of sensor in the vehicle. So collecting video data is data, and it's very valuable. The difference with other types of IoT data is that the camera data, though, generally requires you have to look at it to get the information, or artificial intelligence has to view that video footage to get information. So that complicates things a little bit. But this just shows an example of some of the different devices that are out there. a broad example of the Samsara's camera device, and this is one I actually used when I was in rental cars, and that suction cup that sticks up on the window. But this would go up on the front window of the vehicle, and then this lens here faces outward on the road, and then there's an internal lens that faces the driver. And what all these devices will do is they will record video in a memory card on here that will run in a big loop. So this can hold anywhere from 40 to 120, even 180 hours of data, depending on the resolution and some various other factors for that. So all that data is recorded there. And then if some sort of event happens, like this connects into the vehicle gateway, which is the main telematics unit. So if the vehicle stops quickly or has a harsh event, that information can be used to trigger the camera to upload, say, 15 seconds of video to show what was happening right before that quick stop. And then you can also request remotely and say, I would like to get the video from yesterday, give me, a minute or 10 minutes of video from a certain time period and things like that. So that way, if a serious incident happens, you'll get the immediate video what happened right before. But if litigation is going to be involved, they're going to need sometimes even the whole day of video to see what the driver was doing and where the vehicle was and all the things that set up. So then you can pull that information off. This is a balance between the cellular network really can't handle streaming all the video, or it can handle it, but it's very expensive. So this is a good balance where you keep the video on here and pull up only what you need. And it also helps for driver privacy. When you have inward cameras, you don't want to necessarily collect data that you don't need. That's how cameras work, and this just shows some different examples of things. Yes, Kate.
Are they doing much AI in cabin for facial recognition, drowsiness, inattentive? Is that pretty standard now, or is it emerging?
Yeah, that's kind of emerging to getting to a standard. There is in the Samsara device, for example, there is a AI chip in the camera, but it has a little less obviously less processing capability than something you do on the back end. So it works kind of as a combination. Well, things like that where the driver can recognize if the driver's not paying attention or starting to get drowsy, it'll announce, or it gives 3 beeps to let you know that that's there. And that the driver, give the driver a quick notice that's there, and then it sends that data up to the main dashboard. And often what will happen is the device will detect something, and then when it gets to the back end does additional processing. Well, that really wasn't efficient. That's good.
Following up on Kay's question, do any of these cameras have the ability or IoT sensors to pick up the use of marijuana? It's becoming more and more widespread on a recreational basis in a lot of states.
Most of what I've seen is really just they're trying to use the camera to visualize and recognize things like smoking something and things like that. I haven't heard anything with the detector, but that would certainly be something that could be piggybacked on all these devices. But I don't know if anybody knows they've had. I don't know anything widespread.
Are you saying the smoke detection, or because most of the recreational oral consumption these days, around it? So are you looking for your eyes and recognition?
Anything in there that recognize the driver's impaired.
Yeah, definitely forward. Right now, most of its focus is on looking at the driver's face. Are the eyes getting droopy? Is the driver's attention going away? Are they just getting kind of catatonic? Those are most of the things that we see. And we did learn that if you need to know about recreational drugs, that Kay apparently is a subject matter.
Yeah, Kay.
I have kids.
I have autonomous driving though.
I get told it should
Mine's
be legal
self-driving,
all the
though.
time.
So it makes you look at the road.
Drowsy driving or distracted
Or
driving is
semi-autonomous.
a big thing in all those manufacturers,
Pick that up.
and they all have different algorithms on that. I do know that Nauto, Netodie, and Solera all
We
have
should take a couple.
determined different levels of smoking capabilities, right? That
4
somebody
more
has.
miles to go.
There's one big trucking company that's an Omnitrax customer that wanted to determine cigar versus cigarette smoke. Cigarettes are okay, cigars are not. Figure that one out. Right? So that is actually implemented. It was custom code to have
I think you have to have whiskey to smoke cigars. So that's
Scotch.
what they're detecting.
Scotch.
That's right. Those cigars, cigarettes are cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so behind this then is important that the artificial intelligence in the core. So taking things like being able to use the vehicle diagnostic information and there's also accelerometers in the telematics device as well too that can detect sudden stop. So what you're trying to do is get information from multiple sources and combine it together. So you're trying to figure out from the non-camera information, when do I need to look at the video closer? But then the video itself can detect things, you know, like we talked about the driver information, but like anything with artificial intelligence, there's definitely it's a probability thing. So the ability to have false positives and false negatives definitely occurs. So that's the kind of the hardest challenge that's still there. And different companies take different philosophies. Samsara took more of a philosophy of whatever we trigger on, we want to keep that false positive rate as low as we can. So they didn't really try to detect cigarettes or even cell phone use was something that they're still working on because they really want it to work well before they do it. Other companies take the idea of, oh, we'll put all these alerts in there. And even though they're false positive, there's still, it's better information than you have. So different people are doing
So you're talking about trucks in this presentation. But a lot of this stuff is in current cars as well. Like my Cherokee will every once in a while yell at me to keep my hands on the wheel. And my hands are on the steering wheel. So it's you know, there's stuff built in there. I've seen it, like I'm approaching an intersection and somebody's making a right turn, and I know that they'll be gone by the time I get there.
Yeah.
But the dashboard lights up at me every once in a while, like brake, 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 and I'm like, chill.
Yeah, there's still, this is still relatively new technology.
Yeah.
There's definitely room for improvement. The manufacturers are doing some things. Generally, their approach is a little different than what commercial firms want to know.
Mhm.
And then there's also the older vehicles that don't have it. So there's a lot of different things to do. Like one thing artificial intelligence doesn't do as well as the vehicles can is it doesn't use radar, it just uses the video to try to see if you're getting close, where the radar is a much better mechanism. So there's a lot of things I think are going to try to bring this technology together to do that.
Yeah.
And some of the things what some of the companies are doing now, they're actually augmenting the artificial intelligence with human review options, where they will actually provide a service. The video gets uploaded, they'll actually have humans screen it real quick first and only let the most important things go through in order to screen out the false positives. So that's kind of another approach some people. But artificial intelligence will be learning over time, and you know, it certainly will get better, and it's certainly better than the information that's still. Right, and behind all the scenes, we've got safety reporting. So this is going to be, you know, doing something with the information, providing a dashboard for video, providing driver safety statistics and safety scores, and detailed incident information. All right, so talking about some of the safety vendors, there's some overlap here with some of the people that we talked about before, like Samsara, for example, and Motive that both do, and Solara that do cameras as well as vehicle telematics and things like that. Your question or your
Mike's up.
my mic?
There you go.
Is that better?
Sometimes it comes in and out.
Got it. When I turn my, all right, I'll turn my whole body. But then there's also companies like Linux is probably the company I saw the most. I suspect has the most market share. They've done a fair job. They've had some, unlike in the vehicle world where some of those vendors really seem to have been trailing off, you know, with getting a lot of takeaways. Linux is kind of a mixed bag. They have some customers are really, really happy, but they've left a little room for some new upstarts to get into. But they're certainly a very strong company there. Smart Drive from Solara, Netrodyne, all have really good reputations and seem to be you know, doing pretty well in the market. So there's a lot of good options that are out there. Motive's a little bit newer, but they're taking the same approach as Samsara, which is full platform, telematics, assets, camera, the whole bit, where some of the other vendors are more camera focused. Nano on the right, I thought was going to be a strong leader, but they're kind of going back to my similar story of knowing people at Verizon that left. A lot of people that left Verizon ended up at Nano, but they've now all disappeared. And there was a couple of larger companies that I worked with at Samsara that had only taken Nano 6 months before and were already looking for something else. So I'm not sure that they're gonna do very well. But I did like their hardware design. They have an interesting hardware design where the driver-facing camera goes on top of the rearview mirror, and then underneath is the forward-facing camera. So it's easy to place there. The Samsara device, sometimes it's hard to find a place where it's not in the driver's view and can see the inside of the outside. Okay, so that kind of covers the main cases, vehicle telematics and cameras. I'm going to talk just a little bit before we finish up about trailers and assets. And one example that's pretty needed is the tracking refrigerated trucks. That's very important because the cold chain, to be able to document that you kept the food products cold throughout the whole thing, or some problem happens down the line, if there's some sort of bacteria discovered, that they can go back and understand where were those loads tracked, where were they carried, and make sure all the places in the cold chain that they were covered in. So I did get to work on a project of working with refrigerated trailers. Thermo King and Carrier are the two vendors that are have most of the equipment. They actually have some pretty good telematics capabilities in their own. And like at Samsara, we got a separate device there. They were actually moving over to just take API data from Carrier and Thermo King directly and integrating that with the Samsara platform. So there's an opportunity to do that. But the old way these things work is they have a little indicator light down here. There's a blow up up here, an indicator light on the driver's side, and then it would be green if the unit was operating properly, but it would go red if it wasn't. And before any sort of telematics, the driver would just look in their side mirror to see if they saw the light go red, and then they'd pull over and try to see what happened to the unit. But that's important to be able to track that. And then a lot of companies use refrigerated trailers as storage units. Like a dairy might generate a bunch of dairy products on Friday. They'll load it in the truck, turn the refrigeration unit on, and leave the trailer out in the parking lot all weekend unattended. So there's a need for them to be able to have information and alerts if something goes wrong, and telematics can help provide that.
Just a quick question on the previous one. Do these units that measure the atmospherics within the trailer, do they constantly feedback, or is it also the same? They do it only when needed?
Yeah, there will be a kind of a combination. It's kind of because there's actually an engine that runs in the refrigerated unit. That's running most of the time, so you have power, so you can send pretty much continuous data. But again, it depends on the frequency, depends on the refrigeration manufacturers and the vehicle manufacturers. They're thinking, oh, we need to send it 15 times a second. Where for telematics, might as well, every minute or two is fine. But,
Even less.
All right. So, and then other types of assets are going to be outdoor assets like construction, things like that. Those get tracked a lot, so that's an important thing. Many of the same capabilities that you get in a truck applied to construction equipment, just it tends to be more of a fixed site. On the left side, there's an example of a case where what do you do when you want to track something that you have no power? And one of my customers had these chemical tanks they call totes for carrying chemicals, and they would need to track those. And so that was kind of a problem because they didn't have any power source. You could do a battery operated unit, but then how often does it transmit and things like that? And Samsara's tracker, this unit in the lower left there that ran off of batteries, it can report twice a day and the battery lasts for 4 years. But if you want to do something like every 30 minutes, it would really only last a few weeks. So there was still a problem there with how do you get that data? There's still companies that have been working on that. And then a lot of assets are indoors. Indoor location remains a problem if you don't have a GPS signal.
And with something like a tote, I mean, there's got to be a situation where it gets set somewhere and there's no I mean,
Correct.
you know, a lot of this stuff, I'm not trying to say that it's not worthwhile, but these things that crop up can be really time consuming and aggravating.
Yes.
And I think that's an example. You know, it's like when people talk about satellite being used as a, you know, a solution for IoT in remote areas. And it sounds wonderful, but you're not always going to be, you know, so, and that can really drive you crazy.
Yeah, and I think that to lead, really the thing to lead with too is think that there's still a lot of room for innovation. And there's a lot of problems that still need to be solved. All right, and then I also mentioned here in the lower right, the airport application I was out to Southwest. I also got to go to United Airlines last year too. That was interesting. Their needs are just totally different for understanding how do you service the aircraft and things like that. That was actually a fun trip I had. We went to United Airlines to talk to them about their ground support equipment. We got there, turned out they weren't interested in that, but they were interested in having some sort of camera at the gate and AI that could tell them. But one of the things I got to do is I got to go behind the scenes at their operations center in the terminal area of Chicago here. And that picture there of the different monitors, that was the person's desk. And this guy, he would decide which flights do we hold and which do we release when they were doing connections. So we had all this information about, okay, this flight has 10 people that are gonna miss this flight, but they have another flight they can get on in 3 hours, so we'll release that flight. This other flight, we have 4 people that need to be on that, but there's no flights till tomorrow, so we're gonna hold that one. And I was really pretty impressed with, you know, all we hear about airlines these days. I was impressed about how hard they are trying to make that work. But that's another area where, you know, having better information about, you know, is a catering truck at the aircraft when it's supposed to and getting alerts if it's not there and stuff like that. All right, and this just kind of goes through some of the trailer vendors there. We're getting close on time, so I'm gonna kind of skip through this, but there, again, some overlap of vendors, but there's also some specialty vendors. Fordcom and Skybits are probably the 2 main ones that track assets. They both have satellite offerings. But, you know, as Andy said, and you said, I found that with satellite technology, it's still pretty expensive. It doesn't work all the time. Companies always say they want it. And then when they learn what's involved, a lot of times they're like, all right, don't bother. We'll figure out a way around it. So that's good. I did want to give a special mention, honorable mention to a company called Track Unit. They're based in Denmark and they're active mostly in the construction industry, but they have a new device out that's called a KIN that is a small little tracker that works with their other asset trackers. So you can do things like have tools at a construction site, be able to know where they are on the site, yet still have low power because they only need to transmit, say, to a telematics unit that's on a piece of construction equipment, so they can keep track of lots of other objects. So that's an example of one of the innovations that we're looking for. All right, and then last things for little side applications. The use of cameras other than dash cams. This is a need that's coming up. So side cameras and rear cameras on vehicles. There's a lot of those aftermarket options and even coming with the installed vehicles now, mostly intended for the driver to be able to see what's going on. But that information also could be valuable for other things too, and being able to put together an incident that happened. Cameras inside a trailer to know when are pallets loaded and unloaded and that sort of thing. That's a really key need. Cameras were an opportunity there if you had like a still shot or something, or maybe it's a video of what was going on in the trailer, that'd be very helpful. There's non-camera sensors like cargo sensors that have like an infrared beam or door signals that tell you when the door's open. Those are all things that have some opportunity to identify things. But the customers I talk to, they would really like a way to know, you know, what's going in that trailer, when's it coming out. The biggest challenge with the trailer is there's not a continuous source of power. There's power when it's attached to a tractor, but you know, not all the time. So how do you solve that problem when you don't necessarily have power all the time?
So, Brian, there's a having a picture is one thing, but knowing when it happened is another thing. So there's a need for time code somewhere to link all this stuff up.
Absolutely.
How is that built into the camera, or is that sort of served from a master unit?
That's
On
built
the
in the
vehicle.
camera. Very accurate clock in the camera as well as the Telematics device, and every piece of data gets a timestamp. So timestamp data is like baseline.
So that has to be set.
Yeah, well, it worked because they have access to the cellular network, same as the cell phone,
NTP.
you're able to get the server
Okay.
to make sure that you're in sync. Yes, okay.
Yeah, they're also using RFID tags on pieces or boxes, containers, whatever's put in there. And then, it's probably progressed a lot since I was working with it, but they have a reader when it goes in and off the trucks. So you can track each item that's in the truck. But there again, when it's not at a power location, you can't really do much with it.
That was effectively my question, but I was concerned about, well, I shouldn't say concerned. Are we starting to see RFID readers in trailers now? Or is that not quite?
It's still pretty limited.
Okay.
Most places are doing it like, they're reading like on the dock when they load,
Right.
because that's a little easier than the unload.
For you innovators out there, the Port of Antwerp, Belgium right now actually has an RFP. One of the cool things there is they want camera visibility. They want the camera looking at the steel of the door. They're having a lot of trailer breaches and container breaches. Since the UK left the Brexit, right? There's a lot of drug traffic going from the UK into Greater Europe through the Port of Antwerp. And this is a European Union mandated thing. We're working with a company that's responding to the RFP right now, but it's some really cool stuff where they're actually using that camera data to determine breach, so they know when and if the container was open.
CalAmp told me about 10 years ago that they had a RFID device that was actually sniffing for cell phone ID. So you could actually theoretically determine who was opening it up by looking at cell phones. Criminals aren't smart enough to leave that at home.
They don't own the intellectual property around that. The guys have done working with too. And actually, some of the AI that they're using actually can report jamming as well. That's the other thing that they're getting in Europe. In the US, you can't go out and buy a jammer off the shelf. In Europe, you can walk into just about any electronics store and actually buy a cellular jammer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Guess what I'm coming back from Mobile World Congress with.
All right, cool. All right, well, let's, I'll be around if anybody has any questions, obviously, stay around, but we're out of time for the presentation now. I thank you very much for your attention.
Just give Ron a big hand. Good. Well, thanks for the update. It's really interesting to learn about this stuff. We've come a long way. And it looks like we got some ways to go, but it's very fun to see what's happening. So I want to remind everybody that we have coming up the IoT happy hour. And so that's going to be Blue Ink Security, talking about IoT security and what's happening in that space. These guys are 25 years of experience in the marketplace, and they are going to give us an idea of the business aspects of insurance
And some more stories.
and war stories and the security insurance industry and what's going on in that area as well. And then we got, coming up next month, our IoT breakfast will be Alban going to be talking, and what he's doing with his company, Link America, is very fascinating. The way they're able to track what's going on in manufacturing plants. So I think you'll really enjoy getting to hear what they're doing as well. And then we got Bill James speaking at IEEE CDT. I'm now on the board for them, trying to help them out as well. Here we talk about his J-Pods, which are elevated tracked pods that can go just about anywhere. Projects already assigned for COG, which is the North Central Texas Government Council of Government,
Council members, yeah.
and Arlington, Las Colinas, and Plano have all signed. Plano or Frisco? Plano, right? Plano, yeah. So amazing what he's doing. J-Pods, go look up his website and find out a little bit more about it, and then come listen to his presentation at IEEE. If that's it, guys, then thanks for coming, and we'll see y'all at the happy hour.
Happy.
All righty.
February 2nd.